Good morning. This is Pastor Rick, and I want to welcome you to our next episodes of Work Matters with Pastor Will. This will represent 3 new episodes in Work Matters. This will be 9, 10, and 11. And we want to lift up here Jeremy Paul Myers. He's a professor at Augsburg University in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and he's the professor of youth family ministries where he lifts up discipleship with young people. And that's why we're so fascinated with his these 3 talks, because he lifts up a theme that we're all committed to, and that is the discipleship of youth, whether those are our children or our grandchildren or, well, kids around us that we really care about. And so the next 3 episodes, Pastor will lead us into this important discussion. The first will be on the good news and bad news surrounding youth. And they're surrounded by so much bad news, we want to understand that so we know how to preach Jesus to them, the good news of God. The second session will be on adolescents as undeveloped consumers versus called co-creators. And so there's a theological good news that the professor wants to bring to youth. And the third session will be entitled Adolescence, Understanding the History of Adolescence, How is it developed, and understanding how we can share with them the call of Jesus to be and to do now, not in preparing for the future necessarily, but how they can follow Jesus at this moment. This is a great conversation. Professor Jeremy Myers does a wonderful job. You're going to enjoy this. And so now we ask Pastor Will to lead us in this important discussion.
Thanks again, Pastor Rick. Welcome back, everyone, to Work Matters with Pastor Will. This is the third in a 3-part series from Dr. Jeremy Myers of Augustana University. Dr. Myers is talking about in this 3rd episode today, youth culture, understanding the history and understanding the call. And so he is going to take you back to the 20th century, to the mid 20th century, in a time where great change was occurring, including the change in a whole new demographic that we call teenagers and adolescents. I'll leave it at that. I will let you enjoy the video, and I will catch you on the other side.
I like to do this history. So let me quickly tell you where the undeveloped consumer came from, because we didn't just wake up one morning and decide to think about our young people this way. It came from somewhere. And there are 4, I don't have a thing with 4s, but there are 4, I think, really big cultural shifts that created the framework that grew youth culture. Okay, so I was saying this yesterday. The first wave of teenage culture in America would have been the Bobby Soxers. Are there anyone here who would consider themselves? Are there Bobby Soxers?
Watch the movies.
Yeah. Like that would have been the first.
Cary Grant was in a movie called The Bobby Soxers.
All right. So that would have been the first wave of teenage culture in America. Prior to that, people in the teenage years, like you were either you were a child and then you were an adult, and then all of a sudden you were a child or a teenager, and a child and then a teenager and then an adult, and now you're a child and then you're a teenager and then you're in this new phase that they call emerging adulthood, and then you're an adult. So adulthood keeps getting further and further away from people, right? So I want to explain how that happened. So there are 4 cultural kind of realities. One is this idea called Moratorium, and then there's a set of cultural anxieties that were present in America in the early 1900s, and then the Great Depression, and then the high school. These 4 things sort of combine to create the perfect storm that generated youth culture. So let me dive into this. G. Stanley Hall, in 1904, wrote a book called Adolescence. He was the first child psychologist. All right. So in 1904, this psychologist, G. Stanley Hall, writes a book called Adolescence. And in that book, he's making the argument. And G. Stanley Hall is deeply concerned with child labor. And he doesn't want children to be working anymore. He sees, G. Stanley Hall sees our young people as being full of potential, and they will not reach adulthood with all of that potential. They will not reach adulthood as their fully creative, contributing selves if they have too many challenges on the way to becoming adults. So G. Stanley Hall sees them as a mountain stream, right? From the glacier to the valley below. We should not impede the movement of that mountain stream. Their creative juices, their energy should just be allowed to flow, right? Let them just be wild and creative. Don't put unnecessary expectations in their way. Just let them live their lives. That's G. Stanley Hall's argument. So he's asking for what he called a moratorium. There has to be a break where our young people don't have any adult-like responsibilities, when they can just sow their wild oats and be crazy. And then they'll get to adulthood fully creative and fully ready to contribute to society. All right? This was G. Stanley Hall's theory, based on absolutely no science whatsoever. and everyone latched onto it. So this was the creation of adolescence, right? There was childhood and there was adulthood. Now there's childhood, adolescence, and adulthood, because he had the perfect theory at the perfect time with no evidence whatsoever behind it. And because there was a growing anxiety around child labor. And so people were trying to find a way to justify moving children out of the workforce because they were concerned for their well-being, right? And I'll talk more about that in a minute. Also, so that's the moratorium. We need to bracket the teenage years so that they can arrive to adulthood fully formed, okay? That was the first wedge that between young people and adults. Third, there were massive cultural anxieties in America in the early 20th century. First one, race relations. How will folks who have been enslaved and descendants of the slaves, how will they have power in this? Who will have power in this country? How will the different races relate to one another? This was a massive source of anxiety, a massive problem that America was trying to solve. And with immigration, how will people of different races relate to one another? Second, gender roles, the flapper. All of a sudden, women had money and women were experiencing a little more independence and able to express themselves. How will the races relate to one another? How will the genders relate to one another? Third, how will the nations relate to one another? America was also trying to become a global power, a world power. So these were three massive anxieties that people in our country, it was the air we breathed for decades without maybe even knowing it or being critical of it. It was just, there was anxiety in our bones around race, around gender, and around nation building. Now, if you think about it, this is kind of handy because we just bracketed out a period of life, which we call adolescence. The other thing that's going on at this time is the Industrial Revolution, right? And so you think about a factory, you put something in on this end of the factory, and it comes out this end of the factory something different, right? You put in a bunch of parts over here. I'm oversimplifying this. I'm a theologian. I'm not an engineer, right? There's probably more to it than this. But I think what you do is you put a bunch of parts in over here, and it comes out a car over here, right? Something like that. I don't know. And so we kind of started to think about humans that way also. We bracketed out adolescence, and that became a factory. It became a technology, right? And if we put a bunch of parts in over here, by the time they come out the other side, they'll be fully formed humans. And while they're in that factory, they'll be, we in this bracketed period of life, we can solve the race problem. we can solve the gender problem. We can solve the nation building problem. So this is when scouting happens, like the YMCA happens, because there's a lot of, remember I said we can respond out of anxiety or compassion. There's a lot of anxiety about the future of our country and the stability of our country. And we start to think that this new bracketed phase of life is the place where we can solve it as a country. We put all that pressure on our young people, right? I'm going to keep moving here. The third massive cultural change that happened is the Great Depression. And now we kind of get back to child labor as well. And this you can't see the bottom of it, but this is a poster for the National Child Labor Committee, which was formed in 1904. You recognize that year? What year? What else happened in that year that I talked about? Yeah, G. Stanley Hall's book is published, right? G. Stanley Hall's calling for a moratorium. The National Child Labor Committee is formed in 1904, and their goal is to remove young people from the workforce for the well-being of our children. They don't want children dying in the textile mills anymore. Pretty good goal, right? Here's where it becomes, and this is one of their posters. You can see G. Stanley Hall's thinking here. 2 million child workers under 16 today. We want them to be normal men and women, right? The assumption is that if they work, they won't be normal, right? And here's what's problematic. It took the Great Depression for this group to finally get child labor laws passed. It was the Fair Labor Standards Act, that Fair Labor Standards Act, was passed in 1938. So it took them 34 years to pass that, and it took the Great Depression to motivate the country to actually do it. So here's where I see, as an advocate for young people, I see this as terrifying in that in 1904 we couldn't pass a law for the well-being of our children, but in 1938 we could pass a law for the well-being of our economy. Mm-hmm. Right? So we finally pulled young people out of the workforce for the sake of the economy. We couldn't do it for the sake of our children. And I think we have to own that, unfortunately. So the Great Depression, the culture, the idea of moratorium, these cultural anxieties that were present at the time, the depression, the removal of young people from the workforce, all of these things just become a wedge that gets driven deeper and deeper between young people and adults. And then lastly, the high school. So in 1930, less than half of teenagers were in high school, and by 1940, more than 2/3 were in high school. So in that decade, the American high school became the norm. Prior to 1930, it wasn't normal for young people to be in high school. So now they're pulled out of the workforce, and what are they going to do all day? Run the streets? No, we can't have that happen. Be entrepreneurial? No, we can't have that happen. Let's put them in school. And the way we thought about schools when we created our public schools was shaped by the way we thought about how we made cars, right? Put some parts in here, right? We all know engineering now. You put some parts in here and they all come out the same on the other end. And that's how we thought about the education system when we built it around this time. And now we have massive schools that were built based on this framework, and we can't service children as well as we could with even different architecture. But we've invested in an infrastructure that was based on a misunderstanding of people, and now we're stuck with it. And these four things, the moratorium, cultural anxieties, Great Depression, and the high school become the petri dish that grows youth culture. Okay? This is what allowed youth culture to grow. This is what allowed the adolescent or the undeveloped consumer to grow. And once we created this unique thing called the adolescent, then marketing people just jumped on it, right? And I should have brought them. I didn't. I have some of my mom's old American Girl magazines or 17 or any of those magazines. You flip through them. There's one I love to read my students. I open it up and I say, let me read this, the title of this article to you. And the title just says, "Some Like It Hot." I'm like, and I ask my students, what do you think this article's about? Some like it hot. And they're like, oh, sex? I'm like, nope, sandwiches. It says like, what your boyfriend wants after school is a hot sandwich. And it has recipes for hot sandwiches so all the teenage girls can make hot sandwiches for their boyfriends after school, right? So the marketers, marketing people just jumped on this, right? A new niche market. And post-World War II, the economy was booming, and our young people were actually getting to work part-time jobs, and they had disposable income that they could spend, and they weren't around adults as much anymore. They had cars, Elvis Presley, right? And it was just this whole boom of youth culture that came at that time. And now for the first time in the United States, youth culture was different than adult culture. And that's just been amped up on steroids since then, really. To the point now where we have this thing called the adolescent. That's where it comes from, the undeveloped consumer. So rather than, and I think I'm just gonna do this and then stop. And if you wanna get deeper into these things, you can read the book. Or maybe, and here's another idea. The book has discussion questions at the end of each chapter, so maybe some of you can read it as a group. Rather than thinking about our young people as undeveloped, as a Christian community, we get to think about them as called. That's the vocation piece, right? We get to think about them as called and equipped by God to do God's work right now in the world. And they'll do that work as a 12-year-old. They won't do that work as a 40-year-old when they're 12. But that doesn't mean they can't do it. I mean, they can do it perfectly as a 12-year-old, right? And when they're 40, they'll do it perfectly as a 40-year-old, wishing they were still a 12-year-old, right? So rather than thinking about them as undeveloped, we get to think about them as called. It's not that they haven't fully arrived, they've fully arrived. When they show up here, they're not an adult in waiting. I'm looking at the door as if one of them's walking in right now. They're not an adult in waiting. They're not a Christian in waiting. They're fully gifted and fully empowered now to change the world that they move through. And we get to help them trust that. We get to help them believe that. They're not identity-less. They're children of God. So we would say in baptism, you've been marked with the cross of Christ and sealed by the Holy Spirit forever. Become who you already are. Become who you are. My conversation with Aaron. Trust yourself. Become who you already are. God's already done the hard work of claiming you. You get to just believe that now. Not that that's easy, but we have a community here that's going to help you believe that. Rather than thinking about them as self-centered, egocentric, we get to think about them as highly relational. When they come in this room, they don't want us all staring at them. They don't know how to process that. But they do want you to come up and say, what's your name? What's your name?
Myron.
They do want you to come up and say, my name's Myron, I haven't met you yet. And then if Myron does that 3, 4, 5 weeks in a row, then eventually Myron might get to say, hey, do you ever pray? Tell me how you pray, right? So it might not be calling everyone together to a prayer group. It might be you going up to the same kid week after week after week until all of a sudden now you feel like I can ask them the question I want to ask them.
And don't forget to smile.
And don't forget to smile. Exactly. Yeah. Rather than thinking about them as consumers, we get to think about them as co-creators. People called and gifted by God to work with God, empowered by God to do God's work in the world. See, I should have looked up the Bible verse, because now I'm going to say it and I don't remember where it's from.
1 Corinthians 12:1.
Well, how about that? Did you enjoy that little blast from the past, that little bit of nostalgia? Maybe some of you experienced that time yourselves, coming into the age of the teenager. Did you notice those 4 critical factors that happened in our culture, in our nation, that precipiced, that built up this whole profile of the adolescence, of the teenager? And because of that, until today, until 2020, we still have a media and a culture that caters to and bombards our youth based on this profile that we ourselves, unfortunately, have created. And so Dr. Myers offers some great answers for us. Some answers that I've talked about before that we as the church have in our tool bag. The notion of calling, that we're doing God's work anew, that we're children of God, as Dr. Myers said, through the waters of our baptism, God claims us. That we're relational, that we need to make an effort with our youth to get to know them, to engage them, not just one time, but continually engage them to build up a relationship so that then we can ask those deeper questions, find out where they are with their faith, build them up into this person who has been called as a child of God to do God's work, as Dr. Myers said, to do God's work when they're 12 years old, not when they're 20 years old. And so, we need to do a better job of giving that youth the responsibility to witness, to talk about Christ in their life, to share it with other youth in their own unique way as teenagers. And as co-creators too. I love that quote that Dr. Myers said, "To each has been given a manifestation of the Spirit for the common good." And as our diligent Emmanuel members lifted up, that comes from the 12th chapter of 1 Corinthians. What that tells me is that we're in this together, that each and every vocation from our youth is unique and is also essential for the common good, not just of our church, not just of our body of Christ, but also the whole of creation, because all that God has made is good. And so through their vocations, the youth are called by God to contribute to this common good, just as you are and just as I am as well. And as one of our members lifted up there towards the end that I wanted to share, don't forget to smile. A smile goes a long way when it comes to interacting with young people. It lets them know that you care, that it's the first step to listening to them, to learning more about them, and frankly, to empowering them to be all that God has made them to be. What a great series. We are going to continue to use this information from Dr. Myers here at Emmanuel, especially out at Emmanuel Community Park as we engage with the youth of Northeast Collier County. We want to continue to have these conversations with them, to learn more about them. It's critical now more than ever with the pandemic going on, with the separation of peoples, and frankly with our society pushing teachers and children to go back to school in person. There is a lot of anxiety out there. And so we as the church need to help build these people up, build educators and students and staff up for their journey ahead, and help them learn how to talk about who God is and what God has done for them in their everyday life. Thank you so much for watching this most important episode of Work Matters. We will see you next time. I'm Pastor Will Kittinger. Take care. God bless.